This is Innovation Currency. My name is Leigh-Ann Buchanan, and I am your host. What I want this podcast to help people see about themselves is that innovation is for everyone, and everyone is an innovator.
So I want to ask you on a personal level to think back. When is the first time someone opened up a door for you to have access to do something innovative?
I mean, I can answer that.
You start, and then Howard, you get a little bit thinking.
It's okay to go to family.
Yes,
okay?
No, I mean, because
we're all going to go.
Because that's
interestingly, the question is like, where does it all start? Like, how do we unpack? Like, where did it start for you, and then where did it start for you?
I didn't realize it started for me here until actually I said something on a New World Symphony call just the other day. Because my father would tell me all the lessons I need to learn in the world you learn on the golf course. And we were talking about something in a group around access actually, and what it was around the preciousness of the way we look at the symphony, the way you might look at golf. It's not something that everyone can participate in. But back in, not to age myself too much, but I will. Back in, it's okay. Back in the, that would be the early 80s. My father, I was getting trained to be the next Nancy Lopez. And sometimes there's cricket. I don't think with you, there'd be crickets in the room, but Nancy Lopez was pre-Tiger. She was like the first, either the first or I think the first woman of color who was at the top of the LPGA.
One of the things that I'd love for you to develop a little bit more was this idea of who you were training to be, like that. Who was the role model, the prototype that you were seeking to be?
Well, and I have to be fair here. It was my father. I wish I could tell you that my first experience with the visioning for myself at 13 was that I knew I was training to be this. My father saw that in America, anything is possible. Mm-hmm. And I have to go back, my mother and father came here different times, different ways from Jamaica. So I think I've shared this with you before. My mother came to attend NYU and was one of the two women in the Stern School of Business. And she was 16 at that time from Jamaica. But my father came here in the 50s, right around, or late 50s, early 60s, around the time of the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights Movement and the arts movement happening in New York. And he came here in the fashion industry, but he was driving a truck. But a little bit of reason I mention him a lot is that he was born in Cuba. Grew up in Jamaica, but born in Cuba. And the reason that's important is that that's why he was able to come to the States so easily out of Jamaica versus, my mother and others, your relatives as well, coming here for education and other reasons and being here. So my father, two things. He came to America and he always told me the story around that when he came, because he's a Cuban citizen, he got a check or he got money. And he says, when you come to America and the first thing they give you is just a little stipend to say welcome, he's like, you can do anything.
Exactly.
And then you had these strong Black figures and things that were happening in that time. And I love when I learned more about, and actually going back to art, Gordon Parks would be someone that my father knew because they would be, I'm going to say they're running, they're party acquaintances. You're going to Harlem, you're going to Westchester, these groups of Black professionals and artists, they're all coming of age around the same time in the post or during and post civil rights movement. Then you had that whole age of, all the arts and everything happening in New York. And all I can tell you is that, so I'm a product of these two people.
Yep.
I'm sorry.
They're the first point of opportunity for you.
They're the first point of opportunity. By the time we're living in Westchester County, around the corner from a club called Wingfoot Golf Club, and that's where I would take my golf lessons. And my father's vision was that we would travel the world, and he would come accompany me because I would be one of the top golfers on the LPGA.
Yeah.
He did not talk about race. He did not talk about, he did not talk about race. He talked about me being the best player on the LPGA, and that look at this and look at Nancy Lopez, who is a person of color who was the top of the LPGA, and just saying, you can do anything. And he would say to me, wherever you are is where you're supposed to be. And I would hear this when I was a young girl, and I didn't get it. I was like, okay, whatever. That means I'm sitting here. I didn't get it. But when you went on the golf course, and that same golf course, I'm telling you, Wingfoot Golf Club, the reason I was able to take lessons there is that on the public course where my father could play, at this point, he's a professional and having a business in the fashion industry and all of that. And but he couldn't join Wingfoot, nor could any of our Jewish friends, because Wingfoot was not, blacks and Jews couldn't be part of the club. But I was able to take lessons there because at the public course, a lot of those caddies worked at Wingfoot, and my father arranged for me to take these lessons. So when you're talking about access, at that point, I am going to these situations that in the early 80s, I'm the only, I'm going to say a woman. I didn't even think about that part actually until right now, that I'm this young woman, a black woman who rides my bike onto Wingfoot, the driving range. And the folks that I'm connected with are only concerned, because it's my coach, only concerned of how I hit the ball, learning the lessons of golf and just focusing on my game. When I would come home from those lessons, my father would say, how was your day? And I would tell him all the things around, like, well, no one looks like me. They all look like this guy, Sorry, like, I don't have anyone to talk to or whatever. I would just complain about, I shouldn't be there. That's not my group. And he would look at me and he goes, that's not what I asked you. I said, how was your lesson? How did you do? And so when you're talking, I hope I can change, because that helped to change my mindset by the time that I'm in other sports. I just never really enjoyed golf, but I love to hit. I can hit and putt. No, I love all that stuff. But I took on other sports. But when I was always the only, like I played lacrosse in high school, and I was always in the paper. And I thought it was because I was really good, but it actually was because I was the only black lacrosse player at that time in Westchester County. Yep. So I never thought of, when you're talking about access and innovation, I guess just the mere presence of me may have, I hope, maybe inspired some people to take photos. I would always be the captain. That could be for another reason, again. But that early access and my father instilling in me, again, wherever you are is where you're supposed to be, is why I can, I've met Howard. We met years ago, and he was vetting me for the board of New World, and I didn't have a background in classical music, but I would think of, well, what can I bring to this board? And today we are working with an incredible group of innovators from the fellows and the staff and the trustees around changing the culture of New World. But again, it always goes back to, that's a room that I know that I never question why I'm in that room. And that's something that starts from that early access. I never question any room that I'm in. Others may question why I'm there, but I never question why I'm there. I know why I'm there.
What are some of the roadblocks or some of the barriers, both systemic or otherwise, that you think are inhibiting folks from being more innovative or from really seeing themselves as innovators? Think a lot about kids that we work with. I don't necessarily know if they have the privilege of seeing themselves as innovators because of all of the social, political, kind of cultural barriers that sometimes stand in the way. So I'll go first to you, but then also back to you, Marte.
I guess by nature, in order to innovate, you have to see there being like a light at the end of the tunnel. And so if you don't have any perception of what you're working towards, or what could be, or that something could be different, then it's probably a lot harder to innovate. And in that sense, I think there's a lot of systemic barriers, particularly for the youth that we work with. It comes down to like, what examples do you have of people that have that mindset that's different? That they're not stuck because they're refusing to allow themselves to be in. And I'm not like this, everyone just needs to pick themselves up by their bootstraps kind of mentality on any of this. Quite the contrary. I think it's a radical act of like self-love to to tell yourself that you can have something different. It's also the scariest thing to do, because that is the vulnerability that like you've built up all this armor to protect yourself against. So if you're not sure that you're going to get 3 square meals a day and have a safe place to come home to, and like a quiet place to do your homework, and you know, there's trauma of any sort, you know, either like inherently or immediately in front of you, or generationally, or like you're carrying a lot of things that make it really hard to see that there could be something different. So there's a ton of barriers, and you know, those are rooted in systemic inequalities that, you know, we've never seen proliferate our news feeds more than this moment. So, you know, without speaking to each of them, you know, individually, there's a lot, particularly for people of color, and particularly for youth that are living in poverty, and people that have been there for generations, where the opportunities of ownership and the opportunities of wealth creation and the opportunities of changing your environment, you know, there's a lot of reasons to kind of give up that hope. But if we can put examples and opportunities for kids to see hope in other people, then it really comes down to like, all right, it's a mindset shift. It's a choice that you have to commit to making. And there's plenty of examples of people that have had every barrier in the world against them, but still have overcome it, or been able to, you know, commit to that mindset. I mean, think about Mandela and being in prison and saying like, the only thing that can't be taken from me is my mindset, is my ability to have hope. So, yeah, there's a lot of barriers, but it's possible.
I agree. And before we go to you, Marte, I just think, I don't believe that conversations around being an innovator or being innovative can be divorced from the reality of systemic barriers and the fact that mindset has so much to do with it. And part of what I talk about in the book is that you need to consider these different forms of capital and thinking about creating an innovative identity, because they're natural influences. And I think it behooves us to do that. Otherwise, you are not giving everybody an equal shot at the opportunity to really think about that pathway, because part of who you are is completely out of the equation.
There was a like team building activity, something that we did with another organization one time, and it was, I don't know, it doesn't really matter exactly what it was, but it was something like, you know, bouncing quarters into a cup, and they started out without any, you know, see if you can bounce a quarter into the cup, you have 60 seconds, and then it was like, you know, it was 3 people and you're all trying to do it one at a time, and then, you know, if you got it, it was like, wow, it was awesome, and that was the goal. And then they said, all right, do it again, and this time, you know, you need to get 5 shots in the cup. And everyone's like, oh man, it just took us the whole time to get that one. Like, we didn't even know it was possible. And then almost everyone in the room was able to do it. And then they're like, all right, now you have 30 seconds. And again, everyone was able to do it. And it was like, what stuck with me is, if you are forced to think that something is possible, or that like it can be achieved, or somebody's just challenging you to achieve more, like we need those moments of encouragement to know that things are possible, or the idea that something can be achieved all of a sudden makes you feel like, all right, well, now the onus is on me. If it's not being achieved, I can no longer blame the circumstances around me. Like, I have to take accountability. And so in the inability to divorce innovation from circumstance, like the mindset and like who and how the mindset is developed or challenged is a really important piece of that.
It's the grit factor. Marte, back to the original question, which was thinking about innovation in terms of potentially being a privilege, or what are those systemic influences, whether they're barriers, whether they're factors, they necessarily, in my opinion, influence who you are as an innovator. So curious about your personal experience with that. You're a woman, so that's one place to start. But also thinking about some of the work that you have done and how perhaps you may have seen that in some of your engagements. Yeah.
Thank you. And I'm really unpacking what you two have said. I always think that what makes a person free is the ability to make a choice. And often when I'm working with clients, when I'm working with organizations or leaders or individuals, the question is, where do you have choice? And, you know, I don't think that we can ever step out of the inherent bias and like the framework that we see the world through, because it is so absorbed in us. We can't necessarily even see it's there until we run up against places where we see we are not free, or if we see that other people are not free. So the question is then, how do you make a framework to work forward, to move forward, and being aware of what you can, proactively opening doors for people, thinking about if only the models we have of innovation look a certain way and we're not satisfied with that, coming together and saying like, wait, we have a choice to show a different way. And I think what you were saying about models is so powerful, especially when it comes to people who don't self-identify as innovators or as creative people. I don't use the word creative when I'm asking people to create with me, because it is a barrier. That word in and of itself is a barrier. If I say play or I say, you know, joy, all of a sudden people can they can go there. But I think when we're talking about innovation, it has to be inclusive or it's not going to work. But to be inclusive means the onus is on people who do have privilege to be working overtly, constantly, and proactively to open up spaces for that, to enable people who might not self-identify as innovators to be modeling for them and creating experiences for them to do that. So in my work, that looks like inclusive things, and that also looks like working with folks like you, Chad, and the work that you're doing. Also looking at ecosystems, being able to help a group of small nonprofits that don't have access to whatever practice it is that's going to help them raise more money, to tell their story in a more impactful way. It's all of these little things. And I do believe that just a small intentional impact that is ongoing over time does make a difference. And so for me, my practice is very personal. And because I'm a small business owner, I think about, you know, what are the choices my business can make, and that I, through my business and who I hire, who I contract with, the projects I'm doing, who I invite into my space, the modeling that I do of what inclusive impact or innovation looks like, really does add up, because people are looking to leaders and to innovators in the space to show them what it looks like. And if we're not reflecting on that personally and as leaders, we're not going to have that kind of network impact. I really do think innovation happens not in a vacuum, but in en masse. I don't know, in like a bigger space in an ecosystem or beyond. But we have to be committed to it, and we have to be committed to leveraging whatever privilege and opportunities we have to blow it open and say, listen, you're welcome here, and model that with your choices and with the kinds of ways that you show your own leadership.
I want to talk for a second about purpose and power, which is two topics that don't often intersect with innovation conversations, but I think they go, you know, so closely together, which is this idea that what is the purpose of the power that exists, that we can hold when we fully step into our identity as innovators. And I think a lot about systemic barriers, and we've talked a lot about these barriers that prevent us perhaps from the privilege of innovation, but also prevent us from really accessing opportunities. And so I guess my question for both of you, and I'll start with you, Dejha, how do you think innovation can really be a tool of systemic change? Or do you?
I do. And I think that when you give or when you help folks have access to tools around learning and exposure, you create healthy conditions where they can start tying their own experiences and relationships to places of change. Mm-hmm. If people can see themselves as change makers and they have the tools they need to make the changes happen, that's when you create a growth mindset and an innovator mindset. Mm-hmm. So making sure that we have the conditions, we've talked a lot about community, we've talked a lot about representation, we've talked a lot about access, are really just some of the vital things that you need to be able to cultivate that kind of community and that kind of thinking, I would say. And I think innovation as a word is really interesting, right? Because it's often used and attached to a certain, like a certain paradigm, a certain type of person or whatnot, right? But it's not a destination. It's always like a journey. I am constantly innovating. It's a practice. It's a practice of thinking. It's a practice of cultivating, of building, of failing, of trying again, of failing again. And so, not thinking of things in such a binary way, but really as a continuum and as a series of relationships, experiences, and learnings, I think is the way that we create fertile ground for innovation.
And as you think about the similar question, how might we wield that power as a tool of change? And ought we?
Always. It always comes back to power. Who has it? Who doesn't have it? How is it flowing? And I think part of the obstacles to innovation is that we do not have authentic conversations about power. It's scary to talk about power. But I think it's the only way that we really can unlock the keys to innovation.
MLK talked about the fact that power is nothing more than the ability to achieve purpose so that you can effectuate social, economic, and political change. And when I hear that definition, to me, the first thing that comes to mind is innovators. Like, those are the people that when they wield the power, or when they just go take it for themselves through something that they're doing that disrupts the status quo, they are then able to achieve real meaningful change. And so I guess the question that I have is how have you seen power play a role in shaping the very thing that you are innovating and also who you are as an innovator? Power structures that you've run up against, power structures that you have disrupted, power structures that you have become perhaps disenchanted with and realize that this is clearly not the way we should be doing things. I'll start with you, Felecia, and then I'll go to you, Matt.
I think there's definitely two coins to power. There's kind of power for good and power for bad.
Yep.
And you don't get to do business in Miami without going through or being stopped by the power for bad. Right?
Yes.
And it's just, and that's reflective of every city, but I think Miami, it's very unique, right? So there's that. I think personally having to understand power better, become powerful, and then wield that power so that you can actually effectuate change has been a really hard lesson to learn, right? Like I remember first starting out, like we didn't realize that there were supposedly some rings that we were supposed to kiss in order to do this work. Did not understand it at all. And those were some really hard lessons because we were just like, why is this work so hard? Oh, because we didn't go through the normal process, that we didn't even know the process existed, but we offended people in the process of not going to them and figuring out other ways to make it happen because we did not know there was a process. Right? And so like that makes it difficult because it's so convoluted and crazy. You're just like, what is this? And then when you're talking about being able to impact people and getting to decision makers that sometimes make the process really hard to even get to them to get a decision made. Having to figure that part out. And you talk a lot about raising your social capital. I think that goes hand in hand with power. Having to raise your social capital so that you get the respect of the person that needs to make the decision so that you can do your work. All of this sounds crazy, like it just does. But that is the lesson that we had to learn. And we came up against a lot of really difficult situations in which to be able to do that. And so trying to lessen that load for other people, but then also really kind of train people like, this is how you become more powerful. These are the boards that you have to join. These are the advisory councils that you need to be on so that you can start building these relationships, because we just happen to be in that kind of environment here in South Florida. Is something that we teach and kind of help people fully understand, because at the end of the day, you do need to personally own your power. But I think because, especially if you're talking about Black community, it's you're talking about generations of erasing, not feeling powerful at all, to the point that you don't even know how to spell the word. Like, you're so far removed from what power means, but you know how power has affected you and stopped you, and kind of moving towards this point of like, hey, I can actually be powerful and I can use it for good. And this is a new way of being able to disrupt that. Because I think Matt and I had a conversation last year, or maybe I think right after your campaign, and it was just around that, and it was just like, I can't remember the conversation completely, but almost like, do you feel like you need to be in office to affect change and be powerful? I think you were actually asking me that question, and we had that conversation. And it was just like, at the time, I was just like, I think that there are so many other ways to be influential and be powerful and be impactful that are outside our kind of political climate, but that also is scary, right? So yes, it creates some opportunities that I think are going to disrupt some things, but it's also scary where you're just like, our political climate is so unfair and so weirdly tilted that everything outside is becoming much more influential than what we hope and expect of our political institutions. And that's positive from a tech, like, we're always going to spin it on the tech and innovation side to be positive, but that's also scary about who we're putting into office and what are they stopping, how are they stopping the progress from happening?